Good evening, and welcome to the President's Community Lecture Series. We started this series last year as a 150th birthday present to the community of Fort Collins with the idea that we would bring in some of our best and brightest faculty members and allow the community the chance to hear these people who lecture literally all around the world. And as I was thinking today about what I would say to introduce tonight's speaker, I was thinking back over the people who have spoken in the past at these events, and it strikes me that they all have one thing in common. They see the problem that they're working on from a different point of view than the rest of us. Steve Withrow was able to make dramatic improvements in the treatment of human osteosarcoma because he came at it from a veterinarian's perspective, one that hadn't been seen from the human surgical perspective. You heard from Dr. Diana Wall, who studied soil biodiversity by going to the most barren soils in the world, in the dry valleys of Antarctica. Dr. Lori Peek was talking about studying the effects of disasters on the most vulnerable populations at a time when I think most of us as a society come together and think about the bigger picture in response to natural disasters. This year, we heard from Dr. Brian Wilson, who, having trained his entire career as an engineer, sees large pieces of equipment and doesn't see the need for more energy to power that equipment, but instead sees opportunities to save energy in the use of that equipment. And recently, you heard from Dr. Ajay Menon, who talked about innovation and entrepreneurship from the perspective of a young boy who had grown up in a very poor section of Mumbai, India. Tonight's speaker, I would suggest to you, is very much cut from that same bolt of cloth, except more so. She has always seen the world and the problems in which she has dealt with from a very different perspective. And by coming at that issue from a different perspective, she has literally changed an entire industry. There are few people who have had an impact on their field of study as much as Dr. Temple Grandin. Her story is well known to all of you, and I hope this video that we're about to introduce now will refresh it for those of you who know it and introduce it for those of you who don't.
Dr. Grandin, it's my great pleasure to award the American Farm Bureau Federation Distinguished Service Award. Thank you for all that you've done.
I can go anywhere in the world, and when I say Colorado State, everybody there, even through an interpreter, they say, "Oh, do you know Temple Grandin?"
You see, and I have a paper you might want to read called Assessment of Stress During Handling and Transport.
I've literally been in the jungles of Brazil. I've been in the alleys of Beijing, and people ask me if I knew Dr. Grandin.
They rough them up, or are they nice to the cattle? Well, that's part of the problem.
Doing what's right isn't always easy, but it's always right, and I think Temple always sticks to that. And so she helps people learn that it's okay to stand up for something that's right.
That's getting quoted in lab animal studies, and you see, there's the basic principle in there is how scared the animal gets is how it perceives it.
Her goal for her life could be summed up in one phrase: to make a difference.
Please join me in welcoming Temple Grandin into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame.
She's the most inspirational person with autism in the world. And she lives in Fort Collins. I mean, and she's, professor at CSU. Who knew? Right in your own backyard.
When the different kinds of minds work together, we can have some really great successes. I had a student one time that was good at everything I was bad at. Beautiful at running all the statistics, keeping all the records and everything like that. But the thing I was good at was thinking up the experiment. That's different kinds of minds working together. One geek gets to go to Hollywood, another geek gets to go to Silicon Valley, and there's another geek going on Social Security in the basement, and he shouldn't be there.
I think that Temple doesn't fill herself up with being a hero. That's not what she ever set out to do. She wanted to work. That's what she finds fulfilling, and she thinks that other people deserve to be fulfilled in the same way. And so she's now the voice. Let's give kids the opportunity.
You need to learn your dad's trade. No, I'm serious. And there's a lot of situations where different thinking skills can complement each other. So the first step you need to learn is that there are different ways that people think. Animals have, differences in temperament. It's like people have differences in temperament. Some people get scared easy, some people don't.
The students that we are educating to be tomorrow's leaders, we are trying to get them to think outside of the box, to be more like Temple, so that you're accepting that you have to have an engineer, you have to have an artisan, you have to have a mathematician, you have to have a biologist, and it's only in those interdisciplinary teams are we going to feed the world, are we going to take care of the planet, and that impact alone can't be measured.
She probably became most famous when McDonald's came to her right after she had completed her PhD, and they asked her to help them implement into their supply chain controls so that anybody that produced products for them produced them with appropriate animal handling practices and concern for the welfare of animals. That standard has become a norm for the industry. It is the standard that's utilized by the industry, even by the federal government. To say that she's had an impact is understating it by some degree.
Are you a visual thinker?
I love to see her signing books, and she has young people come up and wants to give them an inspiring message. And they're all looking to her like, how did you do it and help me? And she can see them for where she used to be, with all the stigma, with all the barriers. And she says, find your passion. Tell me what you like to do. Do that. They need to find out who they are, just like she found out who she is.
And when I was 15, I was cleaning a lot of horse stalls, and I was proud of the fact that I kind of basically ran the horse barn. Yeah, I would have never have dreamed things I've done. But I want to emphasize, it's lots of hard work, and it's lots of hard work sustained over a long period of time. It was not easy. So what we need to be doing is change some practices and open up the doors. Thank you so much. I'm really honored.
At a university, we are about looking at problems in new and different ways, and about the development of the minds that entrust themselves to training at our institutions. I would suggest to you that Dr. Temple Grandin's greatest contribution is not that she has looked at her problems through a different lens, or the problems she has chosen to study through a different lens. She has taught all of us to look at and see the value of different perspectives and different kinds of minds. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome a true Colorado State University treasure and my colleague, Dr. Temple Grandin.
Really great to be here. Hopefully everybody can hear me just fine. I'm going to stand over here where I can see what my slides, as I can see them up front here. A lot of things to talk about, and hopefully they're going to work. Okay, there's the title slide. What I want to do is to get you thinking about different ways that different people think. I mean, most of you know that when I was a little kid, I had no speech until age 4, and I was very lucky to get into a very good early educational program. If you have a young child that's not talking at age 3, the worst thing you can do is nothing. You've got to start working with that child right now. And when I was in elementary school, I was good at art. That was always encouraged. One of the problems I'm seeing today, little kids that get diagnosed with autism, is they're not stretched enough. First of all, these labels are not specific. ADHD, autism, sensory processing disorder, dyslexia, a lot of these things get mixed up. But you got to stretch them. Mother knew how to push me just outside my comfort zone. Now, some of the common conflicts we get in the world, out in the world, is the different kinds of minds fighting each other. And one of the reasons they fight each other is they don't realize they think differently. Well, the techies always hate the suits. But then when the tech startups get big, they got to hire a suit, otherwise they can't keep anything organized. You see, that's an example of different kinds of minds. Now, in academia, you've got the people in the field. I gave a talk at the Society for Range Management, and you've got a lot of people doing very innovative things out in the field in range management. And then when the academics try to replicate it, it doesn't work. And I think one of the problems is extremely site-specific. Something that works in this exact climate doesn't work somewhere else. And some of the people that work out in the field that are really brilliant, some of them I think are visual thinkers, more like me. And of course the academic wants to quantify everything. But you know what makes me happy today in the world of genomics is now they're figuring out that the average sized dog just doesn't work in something like biomedical research. They're finding that this drug might be horrible in one particular type of genetics. Another type of genetics, it might work really well. When I was getting my PhD, I used to argue with my thesis advisor, Stan Curtis, about what is science. And he felt science, you had to have a controlled experiment. Had to have a control group, had to have an experimental group. And I go, what's astronomy? You know, it's observation. I'm going to be getting a chance to go visit Fermi Lab, you know, particle accelerator. It's observation. Is the control when you turn it off? I don't know. How about the field of epidemiology? Okay, cases of food poisoning break out, and you start to take specific examples and get a pattern. And then the artists and the accountants, they've never gotten along. And then in my field, you have the ethologists that study behavior out in the field, study the animal's natural behavior. And I was educated in the 60s and the 70s originally in behavior, and the ethologists studied natural behavior. And then the behaviorists, the B.F. Skinner crowd, they said everything's stimulus response. But that wasn't what I learned in my behavior class. So they fight each other. And then you have silly conflicts. Like if you work as a government programmer, do you have to wear a suit to work? No, you don't. But maybe a T-shirt with bad language on it might be a really bad thing to wear to work. You know, maybe something a little more appropriate. And I got asked online a question, how should employers work with some of the people that are different? One of the things is don't be vague. There's a scene in the HBO movie where my boss slammed down the deodorant and said, you stink, use it. And you also need to give them jobs that have very specific outcomes. Well, I had a chance to try out a new 3D visualization system, and I put my car keys on it, see how it would do with car keys. And car keys were very difficult for it to scan compared to something that was a smoother object. Okay, so I have a job for the programmer. I want this to work on my car keys, which it was the worst nightmare for this device. Okay, that's something that's a clear goal. How about scan car keys and then print them on the 3D printer, and I want them to jiggle around on the ring? That's going to be really hard. Well, and you take somebody who's got mild Asperger's, they can do that. Half of Silicon Valley's got mild Asperger's. And just as it was saying in the video, one geek goes to Silicon Valley. But unfortunately, I'm seeing another geek that's just like him, a little math genius, getting kind of a handicap mentality, and he's ending up in the basement playing video games. And that's happening way too often. All right, let's get back to some of the conflicts here. Observation is part of science, because that's where you get the ideas to start experiments. There's an observation. And I don't know what the control for the Hubble Space Telescope is unless I point it at the ground. And then I had some military types tell me that it was a spy satellite in its previous life, so maybe that was the control, but I don't think that's a very good control for astronomy. The other thing is you get into the argument about about anecdotal stuff. Well, epidemiology, that's piecing the bits together, find out where the disease is coming from. You know, when I learned that my thinking was different, it gave me great insight. Because when I originally wrote my book, Thinking in Pictures, back in the mid-90s, I mistakenly thought that everybody on the autism spectrum thought in pictures the way I did. Yes, and then I got some comments on Amazon. Then I started interviewing other people, and I found that some thought in words, and some think in patterns. There really are different kinds of minds. And when I was young, there'd be a mistake made on a project, and I used to say it was because people were stupid. It wasn't due to stupidity. It was due to different kinds of thinking. Though I can tell you, Harley Winkleman, the plant engineer at the Swift plant on my very first job, he made it very clear to me that criticizing some poor welding is pigeon doo-doo. It's not the thing to do. And he made me apologize for that. Now, this is one of my most important slides. I'm a photorealistic visual thinker, what's called an object visualizer. There's now been a number of research studies that show that there really are different kinds of thinking. I was so happy when I found those studies, and Richard Panic and I put them in my book, The Autistic Brain. Algebra was very difficult, so how to get through college? Well, thank goodness, educational fads. In '67, finite math was the required class. Probability, matrices, and statistics. And I'm finding a lot of kids that can't do algebra, but they can go right to geometry and trig. Then you have the pattern thinker. This is a spatial visualizer. In your brain, you got circuits for what is something. That's my kind of brain. Everything is in pictures. The spatial visualizer is where are you located in space. These kids often have trouble with reading. So you got a kid that's a good little mathematician, don't make him do the boring stuff. Go have him do the more difficult books. Then you have a verbal facts mind, and then you have an auditory thinker. And these different minds complement each other. Take the iPhone, for example. Steve Jobs was an artist. And then the engineers have to make the inside of the phone work. You see, that's different kinds of minds working together. And so-called most normal people are mixtures of the different kinds of minds. Now, what are some characteristics of visual thinking? First of all, it's bottom-up thinking. When you think in words, you tend to be a top-down thinker. You tend to overgeneralize. And I find that when I'm trying to troubleshoot a behavior problem with an autistic kid or a behavior problem with a dog, people overgeneralize. Now, if it's a 3-year-old, I can give you a generalized answer. But if it's, 10-year-old kid, I've got to have a lot more information. Bottom-up thinkers form their concepts by taking specific examples and putting them in categories. And I think we need more bottom-up thinking in government. One of the big concerns I have today is what I call abstractification. People get very verbal. I get invited to a lot of colleges to do talks, and I visited an English class. And these students were very interested in trying to make things better in the world. And I had a girl say to me, I want to work on social justice. And I said, that's so abstract. Where would you even start? You see, I worked on improving slaughter plants. Okay, now but the thing is, it's something much more narrow. It's something doable. Okay, there's lots of stuff in social justice, but pick out something doable. Also, get out in the field and find out what's actually going on. Because we've got people going into policy, let's take in USDA, for example, that have never been in a meat packing plant. I don't think that's very good. Also, concepts consist of specific examples put in categories. Also, I noticed details. You know what? The mathematician mind doesn't see the details. I'm going to be giving a little test on that. Silicon Valley did not do very well on that. And I'm going to show you why you need us visual thinkers. And I'm getting worried the educational system may be screening us out, and you need us to prevent some very big engineering disasters. Also, my thinking's sensory-based, not word-based. So people ask me, well, how does that help me with animals? An animal doesn't think in words. It's sensory, smell, touch, what it sees, what it hears. And visual thinking is associative. Now, associative thinking is good at thinking up new ideas, but not so good at record keeping in organization. So when I had the student that was good in all the organization, boy, she could run the experiments. Oh, she was wonderful. We worked together just great. Now, my very first work I ever did with cattle was to get down in chutes and see what they were seeing. And when I first did this, people thought it was really kind of crazy. I mean, you're looking at what cattle are seeing, and if you saw the HBO movie, you could see that I got interested in optical illusions, which brings up another thing. Get kids interested in interesting things. You got to show them interesting things. This needs to start middle school. When I was at the airport just the other day, I picked up this magazine called Make Magazine, all kinds of cool electronic things. How about making a microscope out of your iPhone? And all you need to do this is some plywood, some bolts, and the lens out of a laser pointer. And you've made your iPhone into a microscope, and it won't hurt the phone at all. That's the kind of cool tech stuff. We need to be getting middle school kids interested in that sort of things, rather than getting just addicted to video games. So I got down and I could see, well, the cattle could see the car through the fence. They could see the bottle there. Or they could see a coat on a fence, a hose on the ground. And one of the important things you got to do is give the animal a chance to stop and take a look at that distraction. And I'm finding they've got lots of new people going into cattle handling, and it's still very, very important to talk about these things, because people that are new to working with cattle don't see it, and some of the people that have worked cattle for many years don't see it. Okay, I've been talking about visual detail and what cattle look at. All right, let's see how you do compared to the people in Silicon Valley. How many people noticed that the animal is looking at the sunbeam? Raise your hand. We're doing better here than Silicon Valley did. Silicon Valley trashed this test. And I don't think I get worried about letting the cloud control everything. You know, have the front door of my house electronically controlled? It's got a deadbolt. And you know, about 10 years ago, there was a rapist in town going around. That scared me. I was hanging wind chimes on the door and booby-trapping the doors with magazines and things like that. I'm more concerned about them getting in there when I'm home sleeping. No, the only thing I'm going to trust, a mechanical latch. They'll have to break the window to get in, and there's a pipe in the sliding door. They'd have to bust it to get in. There's no way I would trust that to electronics. Because I've had strange stuff happen. Like I come out in the parking lot and the back of my car is open. You know, there's a thing I learned, and I did do some electronics, a thing called harmonics in electronics is getting some kind of weird signal here. Yes, and they can be hacked. Yeah, I don't think they're, you know, someone was talking about an airplane with no pilot. Well, how are you going to guard that against hacking? You know. Let's look at how that zebra and the horse have got an ear on each other, and the other ear's on me. What's the animal doing with its posture? Animals pick up small differences in posture. And always get nasty. They're scared of getting slaughtered. They behave the same way at the slaughterhouse as they behave out on the farm. They're more worried about the distractions, like 3 people standing where they absolutely should not be standing. They just shouldn't be there. Now, an animal is very specific in how they think. Man on a horse, man on the ground. Different pictures. It's really important to get your cattle trained to both the man on the horse and the man on the ground, because it's not very safe for cattle handlers if the cattle meet their first man on foot at a packing plant, because the flight zone goes from 3 feet to 50 feet. You see, it's specific because it's sensory-based. Well, if you're working with any of these kids that are kind of different or employ them, got to be much more specific. You know, if they say something inappropriate, like the pigeon doo-doo thing, Harley pulled me down into his office and explained to me I had to apologize to Whitey right now for saying that. And I wasn't going to compliment his welding because it wasn't very pretty, but I apologized for the way I described it. Yeah, Harley did the right thing, and he was very direct about that. Now, that's one of my curved facilities. And when you're different, I learned I had to sell my work. You'd sign it in a complete half circle because the cattle want to go back to where they come from. One of the things I always want to teach students is use behavior, not force. And a lot of these kids that are different, they can't get through interviews and things like this. I learned how to show my portfolio off. I'd show my drawings, show pictures of jobs, things like this. You know, and that's one of my new designs. There's been a lot of people want to get things that aren't so expensive. Steel costs are really high. Come up with a new design. It's much simpler, no catwalks on it. And you stand on that little grating, and you stand there with that flag, like the video showed, and the cattle will come right on around you and go up the chute. All right, how does association thinking work? Because for the word thinkers, I want to give you some insight into some different ways of thinking. Well, the way my mind works, you say a word like shoes, and I start to get pictures. All right, so I say shoes. Now I'm saying childhood shoes. Had to dress up on Sunday. Oh, now I'm feeling these horrid scratchy petticoats I had to wear along with these shoes. And these shoes have much better memories. Lots of fun time riding bikes, walking along the beach, flying kites on the beach, all kinds of fun stuff like that, wearing these shoes. Those white ones did not stay white very long. And I love it that our stuff from the 50s is coming back in style. I think that's just great. Now there's a shoe I wear today. And so why am I associating that with a mud puddle? Because at the time I was making these slides, I had to jump over a whole bunch of mud puddles on another college campus, and I stepped down, and my foot got wet, and that's how I went from Ariat boot to mud puddles. You see how there's an associative link? Now I'm remembering a nasty time at the University of Illinois. It was slush this deep, a real narrow sidewalk like this, and this guy comes by in a car and deliberately drove his car to completely cover me with icy, muddy black. And there's actual scientific evidence for the two kinds of visualizers. There's refereed academic studies on this in my autistic brain book. And there's one of my drawings. Being a weird geek was difficult. And I'd whip out my drawings, and they'd go, ooh, you did that? Now, I noticed some interesting, disturbing things that happened when the industry went from hand drafting to computer drafting. I started to see strange mistakes on drawings. They were not seeing their drawing. I mean stuff like the center of a circle was not in the center of the circle. They just weren't seeing it. They were perception mistakes. I had an opportunity to go visit Pixar, and they were telling me, well, sometimes you got to just get them off the computers. And then I also noticed that some of these designers that are doing work with 3D printers, they'd print out the things they'd drawn, and they would put it by the computer mouse so they could hold it and touch it. You see, they got to feel, got to touch. I used to joke around that I had a huge internet line for visual thinking. Turns out I've got a big graphics certificate. It's probably in about the top 25%. And this is a normal circuit for speak what you see. Goes from the visual cortex up to the language area of the brain. That's mine. It's got a whole lot of extra bushies. Now the thing is, at what point is an extra bush abnormal? These are continuous traits. You know, sort of look at personality like a music mixing board. I can make more visual thinking, less visual thinking. I could make more mathematical ability or less. Now, there's always trade-offs. I paid a price for that. If you count the number of fibers, I got less fibers for speak what you see, and that probably explains the speech delay. Well, this explains why math was so hard. You see, if I don't have a picture, I can't see it. When I took finite math, the math teacher used to say, why do you take so many notes? Because I've got to have it all written down. But don't dismiss us visual thinkers, because I'm going to show you an engineering disaster where a lack of visual thinking had a lot to do with causing it. Also, people, all the social stuff also had a lot to do with them not fixing it. When back in '68, Bill Gates and I both had access to this IBM computer, Fortran programming. Yes, I wanted to do it. I just didn't get it. Okay, give you a glimpse into the mind of the pattern thinker. That praying mantis is made out of a single sheet of folded paper. And what you see in the background is the folding pattern. I want to give you a glimpse into a mind that's not my mind. This is the mathematician that can do everything in his head. And then the school wants them to write out all their work. And the kid gets totally frustrated. Ends up in the basement playing video games. He should be in Silicon Valley. Oh, a phone, let's stomp on it. Okay, it's one of my pet peeves. Okay, there's some really cool little origami stars. When I was in high school, I got bullied and teased. And the only places I was not bullied and teased was getting into specialized interest things. Electronics. And I was looking at this thing in the Maker magazine on little bits, electronic parts. They were very cool. Oh, your phone's still acting up there. Okay. It'd be fun to stomp on an iPhone. Might be kind of expensive. Now, when I think about something like church steeples, I see pictures, specific ones, all around Fort Collins. And I got my first inkling. Okay, I saw the comments on Amazon.com, and I started asking people, I started interviewing people about how they think. This was back in the mid-'90s. And I talked to a speech therapist, and I said, think about a church steeple, and she goes, pointy thing. Just 2 lines. I go, I don't get any pointy thing. Well, then when you ask the astrophysics guy who worked on the Hubble Space Telescope, he goes, motion. He saw motion of people praying and singing. I go, oh, wow, that's trippy. Wow. Just to show you there's several different ways you can do the math, more verbal or do it more visual spatial. I think a better way to approach some of these problems like Common Core is look at it as a destination. Let people take different routes there. Some are going to do it more verbal, some will do it more visual spatial. People fight over teaching reading, phonics versus whole word. Teach both, because your end result is reading and doing the math. I've worked for years in construction, about 20 years. Design a job, supervise its construction, start it up and make it work. And when you work in construction, it's all about outcomes. You got to get a job done. Okay, you look at a kid that's kind of different and it's got some kind of label. I want a good outcome. Stay out of trouble with the law, get a good job. There's not enough emphasis on what the outcome should be. Now, there's a brand new study showing that there is evidence for different kinds of thinking. All right, let's look at some other ways to look at these differences. Visual thinkers tend to be associational, word thinkers more linear. Picture and patterns versus words. See, this is where the mathematicians, my type of mind, can be put together. Top down for words, bottom up. I think the other way, bottom up. Then you get less social or more social. I think there's a wide variety of minds that are, what is normal? I read an interesting ancient old neuroscience paper, I think by a really well-known neuroscientist, and he said, what if you lived in ancient Vienna and you were terrible at music? They would say that you had dysmusia. That society really placed a high value on being music. And the word thinker grossly overgeneralizes. And I think this is one of the problems we've got now, a lot of policymakers. Think of these traits like a music mixing board. It's not black and white. There's no black and white line between geeks, nerds, and mild autism. In fact, over the years, they've been changing these diagnostic things. They are not precise. Half based on science, half based on doctors squabbling around conference room tables. You know those little boardrooms they have in Hyatt's? That's where they squabble over this stuff. What would happen to Albert today? No speech until age 3. How about Stevie? He was a weird loner who brought snakes to school. And I've been out to Silicon Valley, there's cube after cube of them, making a lot of money programming. The geeks and the nerds, they run some really big, important businesses. Now, what I'm saying is a lot of kids today are getting labels, because unfortunately in our system, to get any kind of service, you have to have a label. And I'm worried that our educational system is screening out some of our brilliant kids. I'm really, really concerned about that. Kids that we need. And here's major CEOs that were dyslexic. This is a great article by Betsy Morris. It's in Fortune magazine. The head of JetBlue had ADHD. Really good on getting it started, but terrible at operations. They had that mess at Kennedy Airport with the snow. That's operations. Yeah, I'm sure he's got a good operations guy now. How about the head of IKEA who had ADHD and dyslexia? He's a real successful business person. And Steve Jobs was an artist, and he made the iPhone interface. That was done by an artist. And the engineers and the mathematicians make the inside of the phone work. You see, in any kind of design stuff, you have the industrial design. Industrial design is basically what did with cattle handling facilities. And then you've got engineers. They work together. You have the visualization side, and then you got the engineering side of designing things. Now I'm going to show you why all the math heads and the engineers need the visual thinkers like me. Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster. Why did this happen? Well, when I found out why it happened, I'm going, how could you do that? Well, what I've learned is the engineer doesn't see a problem like water coming into the basement with no waterproof doors, and your emergency cooling pump and emergency generator is now flooded. You see, I see the water coming in there. I can't design a nuclear reactor. But there's no way. This is next to the sea. I looked up the rules on nuclear power plants. You have to have a backup for everything. They had a 10-meter seawall. There was no backup. The backup would have been watertight doors. The water went in the basement, drowned all the emergency equipment. Then the next problem was social. They never called for help. How could you do that? How could you let 3 reactors burn up and have breach of containment? which is like so awful, just for social reason. All you had to do is pick the horn up and ask for help. They didn't do it. I'm getting concerned today that too many kids are removed from the world of practical things. We have a huge shortage in skilled trades. The average age of people in farming and ranching is over 50. There's a lot of millennials getting interested in local, and they want to get back to the land. We need to help them do that. But we've got to be doing things with kids in middle school. We've got to hook them early. Well, here's the things that really helped me. I worked in the horse barn, riding, did lots of carpentry work, ended up going to a very expensive boarding school, and I didn't study at all for 3 years. But I cleaned a lot of horse stalls, rode a lot of horses. I did construction work too. I did adult roofing. Well, I don't think that'd be allowed now. When I was 15, would definitely not be allowed now. The horse stall cleaning, yes, because we need to be finding paper route substitutes for these kids. Things like walking dogs for the neighbors, setting up chairs at a church or a community center, something where they're working outside the home. But I think what Mr. Patey realized is I was learning working skills. And for these kids that are different, that's super, super important. I'm seeing too many of them get kind of overprotected, and they're not going anywhere. And the same geeks I went to college with that all got jobs, and a lot of them run businesses. Hands-on classes, things like 4-H was really helpful to me. FFA, I think it's really bad that some states have cut funding for FFA. I think that's horrible. I don't think it's very good when a school raises almost $500,000 for sports facilities, but then cuts money for band. Because the band's could help a kid that's different get into a good career. Students ask me, how did I find my interest in cattle? I was exposed to them when I was 15 at my aunt's ranch. And I think a lot of students today aren't getting exposed to enough different career-related things. They aren't cooking, sewing, woodworking, building things. That's why I really like things like, robotics classes, this Make magazine. It's called Make Magazine. It's really, really cool. Just look it up online, Make Magazine, M-A-K-E, and it's got lots of electronic projects, but they're physical things. They do physical things, like making a microscope out of a phone. Well, people need to get a little more respect for the skilled trades, because when you take the cover off a jet engine, it's pretty complicated. And I fly on the plane all the time, and I want all those little complicated things you see there to work on my plane. Yep. Young people today want to know where food comes from. They really do. And there's been a lot of interest in local. You got big ag, you got little ag, and they need to stop fighting each other. I had an interesting conversation in an elevator just the other day. I met a young seed salesman who worked for an independent seed company, and we got to talking about GMOs and talking about GMO-free. He says, I sell both. We do both. It's all ag. I learned a long time ago, sell your own product. And looking at some of the issues like big ag, a lot of people think it's bad. That's shown up on lots of surveys. I think what we have to worry about, it's fragile. Let's look at the debacle going on with the shipping out on the West Coast ports. Containers of pork. Yeah, I see you, Lily, there from JBS. Containers of pork out there, they had to be thrown in the garbage. Containers of beef, they had to just freeze. Container ships getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Big is fragile. In 2007, there was a power failure that took out 4 miles of the big, huge electric towers. Well, plant's not going to run on generator. And it took like a month and a half to build those towers back up again. Work done at Purdue University showed that 31% of young people have never been on a farm of any kind. And a study done in the UK, they found people under 25. Yeah, isn't this ridiculous? 50% of young people under 25 could not connect the picture of the pig with the picture of the bacon. I get concerned about finding out that almost a third of millennials get all their news off of Facebook. What worries me is people just getting way too narrow. Well, this is weird. Pig Adventure and Fair Oaks Farm. They got a beautiful big dairy, great pig farm, open to the public. You know, Ag needs to be opening up the doors and showing things. They do a fantastic, fabulous job with this. And I asked them, what's your most common weird question? Are those actually pigs? Well, maybe they're Disney animatronic pigs, but they're not. They're real pigs. And it's a real farm. I'm getting worried with all the apps and things, with people getting in their silos worse and not going across things. You look at the New York Times on a phone, you're going to be much more likely to just read your interest areas. You read it on a desktop or on the just the old paper. I mess up the planes with lots of old papers. But there's like 10 different subjects right there on that front page. I read stuff that otherwise I wouldn't necessarily read. I'm getting worried about people getting too much in their apps. And then I'm also getting worried about people believing silly things. Although I couldn't believe this conspiracy stuff about the Denver airport. You want silly. You know, you all know they have those tunnels from the old, broken, abandoned, high-tech baggage handling system that didn't work. Well, now they have aliens in them. There's a secret door with a number on it that's a militarized door. There's some kind of GPS coordinates with the aliens. I'm going, really? So I knew one of the news stations in Denver went and did a story on it, and they toured the tunnels. And then there's stuff with the time capsule and the artwork as part of the conspiracy. And then I look at over 200,000 people looked at this video, and half the people loved it, and the other half disliked it. And I'm going, I hope we don't have 100,000 people that actually believe it because they dislike that video. I'm going, that's scary. But I'm getting worried because when you get away from the world of real things, you're more likely maybe to believe that kind of stuff. You know, we've got to get back doing real stuff. Well, I like to talk about taking down silos. And originally I was going to get a picture of blowing them up. So I go on Google Pictures, and I get all these pictures of blowing up silos. And then I found this silo where they were chewing it down with a hydraulic chomper. And they're chewing it down, even with a hydraulic chomper, it takes a long time. Because I'm getting, you know, we've got to get out of the silos. I'm seeing kids on the autism spectrum kind of getting in that silo. You know, then you got people in Silicon Valley, oh, we avoid all the labels. Farming people are in their silo. We've got to get communicating across the silos. And I've made a point in my speaking engagements. I like to do an autism talk, maybe a Silicon Valley talk, do a farm group, and then do talks like this, and try to deliberately go across the silos. We've got to, this is getting worse. I think it's a real concern. You got to show kids interesting stuff, like I was shown the optical illusion room. That was a great project. And there's one of my designs done in SketchUp. It's a free drawing program. I talk to a lot of low-income folks, come to the college talks, and tell them about free classes they can get online, stuff that they'd be able to do. And I like 3D printers because that gets the computer world back to real things. The 3D printer itself is not electronic. It's like a little glue gun that moves around. And I think it's interesting that they say that patience is required here to make this work. That's something a lot of people need. And now getting to the end of my talk, and it's going to be time to have President Frank come up here, and we're going to be doing a question and answer. And then afterwards, of course, we're going to sign a few books. And it's click and clack, the Tappet brothers say, yes, the shameless commerce vision division. So thank you for coming.
Great job. Thank you. So if you have questions, there's a microphone up here. If you'll come on up, or Mike will perhaps be able to find you. But there were questions submitted online ahead of time, and I'll start with a couple of those. What can public school systems and teachers do to help students on the autism spectrum be successful and to develop their skill sets?
First of all, with the changes in the DSM in 2013, they've made the autism spectrum so wide that it makes it very difficult for teachers. See, it used to be you had Asperger's syndrome where you were geeky and socially awkward with no speech delay. Autism, you had to have speech delay. Now they've merged it all together. So now you've got one end of the spectrum, you've got somebody that could go to Silicon Valley. The other end of the spectrum, you may have an individual that no matter how much you've trained them, they can't dress themselves. That makes it very difficult for teachers. Now, if someone asks me what to do with the 3-year-old that's not talking, I can give you a simple answer. 20 hours of intensive teaching, you can use ABA, Pivotal Response, Denver Start, there's a number of different programs. But when they get older, I have to have a lot more information. First of all, they're bottom-up thinker, develop strengths, but you also have to be very specific. You cannot be vague in working with them. Hinting doesn't work. And then teaching social skills, the way it was taught in the 50s, was when you made a social mistake. Let's say I did that. Instead of screaming no, they would say it's not polite to put your finger in the water. They'd give you the instruction. Okay, we're in the store and I grabbed candy in the store. They'd say, put it back, we're not buying candy today. They give the instruction. I call that a teachable moment. You always want to keep using these teachable moments. Another thing you've got to do, some of these kids have auditory processing problems, and even though their auditory threshold's good, they do not hear hard consonant sounds. You might have a kid labeled ADHD or labeled sensory processing disorder or auditory processing disorder. They'll all have the same problem. Slow down when you talk to them. Enunciate consonants. Another thing you got to do is give the kid time to respond. The wheels up here turn slowly. You've got to wait for them to respond. Teachers tend to talk too quickly. When I was 5, I had a very frustrating time when I had a little workbook assignment where I had to mark down all the pictures that began with B as in beautiful, and I marked the suitcase as a bag, and they didn't give me time to explain that in our house those were bags. That was very frustrating.
The second question we have here is, how can we better recognize and reward different learning styles, both in children and adults?
When I was a young child, my ability in art was always rewarded, and they didn't praise every little thing. See, when you're trying to get language started in a kid, yeah, you have to praise every little thing, but then once they get a little older, I wasn't praised for something like being on time for dinner. That was just expected. But when I did a really good art project, that was encouraged. Also, you want to take it and broaden it out. I would have just drawn endless horse heads unless I'd been encouraged to draw maybe, okay, let's draw where you go on the horse. Take those fixations, broaden them out. That's one of the things you want to do.
I had the privilege of introducing you at a talk in Denver once, and you talked during that lecture about different types of light and how things look differently. Would you share some of that with the audience?
Yes, some individuals have visual processing problems. I don't have this problem, but there's a lot of sensory issues. Kids get labels, learning problems, dyslexia, sensory processing disorder, things of this sort. Sometimes when they go to read, the print jiggles on the page, and you can sometimes correct that by printing the homework on different pastel papers, maybe lavender, tan, gray, light green, pale colored glasses sometimes work. I want to make it very clear, this does not work for all dyslexia, but there's a subgroup where this works, and that's such a simple intervention. It'd be silly not to try it. See, now getting back to the different kinds of thinking, that only works in a subgroup. So if you take all the dyslexics, you can look it up online, and it says it doesn't work. But it's a subgroup where it does work. And when something's that simple, it's colored paper, you'd be kind of silly not to try it.
Thank you. We have questions from the audience?
I'm going to pick somebody. Okay, right, here's the...
And if it's... I'll come to you. We were going to do the microphone thing, but I think this will work better for me to... And if you want to raise your hand, and if you do have a question, we can pass the microphone into the row to get it to you as well.
So I apologize if this is something you've discussed before, but I'm interested to know how you experience a poem when you read it in your mind.
I like to hear poetry, actually. I was listening to NPR this morning in the car, and there was a poem in there about something being as black as being in total darkness with a flashlight with a weak battery. And, now I kind of saw a picture of that. But to me, poetry has to be read because there's a rhythm and a sound to it.
Mike, I think there was one over here as well. Oh,
Should have worn my running shoes.
This gentleman here.
I have a very important question for you. I have an Australian Shepherd that stares at my wife all the time.
No, he does.
And we can't figure out why, and we can't get him to stop. And I knew if I came
He stares
here
at your wife
tonight-
all the time. Does he stare at other women? I don't know, but you see, all right, in order to figure out a behavior problem, I have to start asking questions. You know, where does he do this? When does he, does he do it just at home? Does he stare at any other people? Now, there is a behavior in herding dogs called eye, and they'll crouch down and do that, towards cattle or sheep. They'll do that same behavior. But I'd have to ask a lot of questions to try to figure out why. I find one of the biggest problems on troubleshooting behavior in animals and people is a tendency to overgeneralize. People say, what are we going to do about autism? Well, once I get past age 3, I got to have a lot more information. Or what do I do about dyslexia? Well, I got to try to question and figure out what kind of problem they've got. Now, that's a narrower range. But I have to, ask quite a few questions.
Maybe you can get some more answers at the book signing.
Okay, maybe.
There's one back here.
I have a question about your opinion on Ritalin and all the drugs that they're treating kids with these days, and what the alternatives you would suggest for people to do.
Okay, there's way too many drugs given out like candy to little kids. Way, way, way too many. And in my book, The Way I See It, especially in the 3rd edition, I got an extensive section there on medication. The thing about Ritalin, I love it, hate it, you'll know after 1 or 2 pills. There is a certain group of kids where it works extremely well. I get very concerned about too many of the high-powered antipsychotic drugs being given out to young children because they can cause diabetes, weight gain, neurological problems like tardive dyskinesia. I take a low dose of antidepressants. I have been on them for years and years, and it stopped the constant anxiety attacks. Visual thinkers tend to be anxious. I've seen this with other visual thinking designers that I've worked with that are not autistic, and I write about that in my book, Thinking in Pictures. Basically on the medication thing, the younger the kid, the more conservative you want to be with medication. But there's a tendency sometimes to just throw prescriptions at things, and I'll talk to a parent where they're on 7 different things, and when I start detailed questioning, no thought went into this. Every time there was a crisis, chuck another drug at it, up the doses. I think kind of a good rule of thumb is, let's say you try a medication. It should have some wow factor, like, wow, this stuff really works. You don't give out a powerful drug to make a kid a tiny little bit less hyper. For sleep problems, melatonin sometimes works. And I was reading some interesting experiments that are being done with, yellow filter glasses, like yellow safety glasses worn in the evening, changing melatonin levels. Now, that's a simple thing. You can buy some safety glasses at a safety store and try that. Exercise, I found that that's helped me. Lots and lots of exercise. It isn't as simple as saying, well, we don't ever use a drug, but careful, conservative use. And then there's people where, let's say they're bipolar, they find some meds that really, really work for them, where they're nice and stable. Don't go off your meds. Don't. I've seen horrendous disasters with that.
First of all, thank you for all you've done. Based on your experience of trying to explain solutions that you see to those that think linearly or in words, what advice do you have for those of us?
Well, the thing that's been helpful is just recognizing there are different ways that people think. And now I understand that if I just jump from one subject to another, they don't understand the association. So I have to explain it more carefully. I now understand that I see problems with overgeneralization with verbal thinkers. I think this is problems sometimes with people in government. It's all politics and abstractions, and they just fight rather than figuring out how do we actually solve problems. I think some of them have gotten too far away from the world of doing physical things. But just being aware that there's different ways that people think is helpful. When I was younger, something like the Fukushima nuclear power plant, I would have said it was because they were stupid. No, it's not stupidity. The mathematical mind doesn't see the water filling up the basement. Okay, just recognizing that there's this difference can help you deal with it. Then people can ask each other questions.
Professor Grandin, thank you so much for your contributions in so many facets. I have a two-pointed question. Number one, I don't know that very many people know about the Temple Grandin School in Boulder County. If you could just say a couple of things about who it's targeted for. And number two, what do you do to have fun and relax?
Well, the Boulder School, I'm not on their board. I'm totally separate from them. They mainly work with the Asperger type of kids, fully verbal kids. They do a lot of them getting jobs out in the community, which is really a good thing. Well, I really like, science fiction movies, Star Trek, Avatar, Gravity. I don't get much chance to go in the theater, but I make sure those are seen in the theater with the 3D glasses, and other movies get watched on the plane, but not those.
I'm just curious, over here. Between visual thinkers and verbal thinkers, if you have like somebody who's great at being visual thinking, would you want to expose those kind of people to verbal thinking so that they can have both skills and not just corral them into?
Well, there's a lot of, I think the way to look at it is there's a lot of plasticity. I've gotten better, I think, at communicating with the verbal thinkers, but you're not going to take me, like, let's say, one end of the music mixing board slot to the other end. I think the way I look at it, try to explain things I've observed, things I've read in the literature, is where innate ability, I think, makes the biggest difference is extreme ability, or maybe extreme disability, and then in the middle there's a lot of plasticity in the middle. But you're not going to make me super good at, pattern type thinking math. Now, I get asked about something like speaking skills. When I gave my very first talk, I panicked and I walked out. And those sorts of things, improve with practice. Okay, I started out having really good slides. Now, if I have to do a talk with no slides, then I make sure I have a list, the things I'm going to cover on a list, and I go down through the list. That stops rambling and freezing up.
I just have a question about, say, like, if you have a kid that is learning 2 languages and they have dyslexia, would it be them to focus on one language or both languages at the same time?
Well, let's figure out what the dyslexia problem is.
Well, getting, I don't know, letters mixed up, like B and
Well, you see, you get
D
letter
or
reversal.
P
See, it's
and-
different. See, this is where you got to break dyslexia down into subgroups. One of the subgroups is what's called phonological awareness. They're not hearing hard consonant sounds. Now, autistic kids get that problem, and it's just called auditory processing disorder. But it's the same thing. The brain has a hard time picking out the hard consonants. Then some kids do letter reversal. And the other problem is this print jiggling on the page. Now, the print jiggling on the page is actually one of the easiest ones to fix. Things like colored glasses and the colored paper. I talked to a cattleman recently who'd spent thousands of dollars on his dyslexia, and I told him about the colored paper thing. He says, "Oh, I got lavender paper in my printer now. It's great." But I want to make it very clear. This only fixes a subgroup. And I would guess on that subgroup, doing more than one language would not be an issue. There's quite a bit of research that shows that learning 2 languages is good. I think you have to look at it. Is he a real young kid?
Well, not.
How old is he?
I guess the kid is me.
Oh, okay.
When I was younger, my mom and my grandparents focused more on me learning English because I had, well, dyslexia. And now I'm learning Spanish, and I can find that it's harder for me.
Well, okay, there's two things to learn in Spanish. The verbal, speaking it.
Which I'm pretty good at since it was my first language. But the reading and writing part, since I was focused more on English,
it might be
kinda
easier
hard.
for you if you learn to speak it first.
Yeah.
Now, if I had to learn, I was horrible in foreign languages. If I had to learn another language, I would have to learn to read and write it first, because I don't hear well enough the hard consonant sounds to pick it up, people talking. So I'd get an airline magazine and these things that have a side-by-side translation, the dictionary, learn how to read it. And then I find what happens in Spanish is I start to pick out a word there and a word there that I start to understand. But for me, I'd have to learn to read first. Maybe for you it'd be easier to learn how to speak first.
Well, I got the speaking down. Now
Okay,
it's the reading.
The speaking did.
Over on this side, Temple, to your left.
So my question for you is that you really seem to be a proponent of different kinds of thinking. Do you think that a traditional grading system, for example, assigning someone a grade like A or B, can be sort of a hindrance to different types of thinkers?
Well, I don't think that, there's going to be certain subjects where you might not be very good at it. I got a D in French, but and I got a B as in Bravo in the finite math class. And a very nice math teacher tutored me. Not necessarily. That's kind of a gross overgeneralization, I think.
Hi, Dr. Grandin, over here again. So my question pertains to children on the autism spectrum in school districts. How would you recommend that we start getting the attention of school districts in recognizing what you're here talking about today, and that there are different ways in which we think? Because they tend to be categorized in this one solid group. They all have to meet this grade, and they all are taught the same way.
Well,
If
if
our
you get
brains
kids that are
thinking.
different, they do have different ways of thinking, and education is the worst, absolutely the worst field for top-down crazy fads. When I went to college, we went through the absolutely ridiculous Skinnerian teaching machine fad. And I remember a horrible psychology book that was like programmed text. I mean, they very quickly dumped it. But the finite math fad saved me, absolutely saved me. But I think let's look at outcomes. You see, working in construction, you build a job, and then you start it up, it has to function at the end of the job. Okay, at the end of the third grade, I want to be able to read, these kind of books or do this math. And there could be different destinations to get to that same outcome. You can take the freeways, or you can take the side streets, or you can take airplane, take a car. There's different ways to get to the destination. And some of the stuff that's going on in math, I don't understand what they're doing. Because when I took third grade math, that's where I learned borrowing and subtraction. I marked the page and carried the numbers. Now there's something that when I was just in Kentucky, they were telling me the kids aren't allowed to mark it down. If I hadn't been allowed to mark the paper, borrowing and subtraction, I'd never be able to do it. But the way it was taught in the 50s, I had no problem with it. I was fine fractions, percents, borrowing, long division, big multiplication, find the area of a circle, find the volume of a box. But it wasn't until algebra got to be a problem. But some of these fads, I've talked to parents just with the regular kids. They can't, after about third grade, they can't help their kid with the homework.
And that's probably a good time for us to call that the last question. I know that we could probably go on all night hearing this as well, but I got the signal on my phone.
Well, I'll be down there.
That was a good final question. So
So, ladies and gentlemen, there will be a book signing out in the lobby afterwards. Please drive safely going home. Thank you all for coming to the Community Lecture Series. Let's thank Dr. Grandin.